The conference room on the 40th floor of Halden Industries went silent, the way a room only goes silent when everyone in it senses that something has just broken and cannot be put back together. Marcus Reed stood at the head of the table, a single sheet of paper trembling almost imperceptibly in his hand, while 11 executives in pressed suits stared at him like he was something they had scraped off the bottom of a shoe. Across from him, arms folded, chin lifted, stood Lauren Mitchell, CEO of Halden Industries, the woman whose signature was on every paycheck in that building, and she said the 6 words that would end up on the lips of everyone in that room for years afterward. Anyone could do your job. The air conditioning hummed. Somewhere down the hall a phone rang and nobody answered it. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't offer the excuse that was sitting right there in his throat, the one about his daughter's fever at 2 in the morning, and the babysitter who canceled, and the report he'd rushed through on 3 hours of sleep. He simply set the paper down on the table, reached up with 2 fingers, unclipped the laminated badge from his shirt pocket, and placed it gently in the center of the table, face up, so that his own photograph stared back at all of them. Then he turned and walked out, and the sound of the glass door clicking shut behind him was louder than anything anyone in that room had heard all year. To find out how a man humiliated in front of an entire executive team ended up becoming the person that same CEO could not imagine her life without. Stay until the very end. If stories like this one, about the quiet people who get overlooked until the moment everyone finally has to reckon with what they're worth, mean something to you, we'd love for you to tell us in the comments. So many of you watching have lived some version of this yourselves, and this channel exists because of you. And here's a question worth sitting with before we even get to how it happened. When a company forgets who actually built the thing keeping it alive, is that the fault of one careless executive, or is it something baked into how these places are run, chasing polish over people until the wrong person gets shown the door? 3 years before that morning in the 40th floor conference room, none of this existed. Marcus Reed was not humiliated. He was not invisible. He was, in fact, the senior systems engineer who had personally designed the load-balancing architecture that kept Halden Industries' largest client, a logistics conglomerate worth $412 million in annual contract value, from losing power to its automated warehouse network during peak shipping season. Marcus had built that system from scratch over 18 months, working nights and weekends, because his wife Diane was still alive then, and she used to bring him coffee in the server room at 11 at night, and tell him that someday somebody was going to realize how much he actually did. Diane died 14 months later. An aneurysm, sudden, on a Tuesday afternoon while she was folding laundry, and Marcus came home from work to find paramedics in his living room, and his 4-year-old daughter Emily standing in the hallway in her socks, not understanding why nobody would let her see her mother. After that, something in Marcus went quiet in a way that never fully came back. He didn't quit his job. He didn't ask for special treatment. He simply became a man who left the building at 5:15 every single day, no matter what was on fire, because there was a small girl at a daycare across town whose whole world now depended on whether he showed up on time. He started declining after-hours calls. He stopped attending the strategy dinners where promotions actually got decided. He became, in the eyes of the newer executives who joined Halden after Diane's death, and never knew the version of Marcus who used to run circles around every engineer in the building, just the maintenance and systems guy. Reliable, quiet, replaceable, or so they assumed, because nobody had bothered to open the actual architecture documents and see whose name was on every critical revision. Lauren Mitchell became CEO of Halden Industries 8 months after Diane died, inheriting a company that was, on paper, thriving, and in practice, one signature away from losing the contract that made up nearly a third of its annual revenue. Lauren was 39 years old, sharp enough to have made partner at a consulting firm before she was 30, and utterly unsentimental about performance. She had been brought in by the board specifically to modernize Halden's aging systems team. And modernize, in board language, often meant replace. She did not know Marcus's history. She did not know about Diane. She knew a man who left early, said little in meetings, and whose direct reports described him, when pressed, as solid but not exactly a leader. She had no reason to think otherwise. Because the man who used to be introduced at Investor calls as the architect of Halden's uptime record had, over 3 years of quiet grief, made himself as small and unremarkable as he possibly could. Precisely so, nobody would ask him to give more than he had left to give. The third figure in this story arrived at Halden the same month Lauren did. His name was Derek Song, a polished, Ivy-credentialed systems director, who had a gift for saying exactly what a room wanted to hear, and an equal gift for letting other people's work quietly migrate into his own name. Derek was charming in the specific way that charm becomes dangerous in a corporate environment. He remembered everyone's kids' names, he sent thoughtful follow-up emails, and he had, within 6 months of joining, positioned himself as the primary contact for the very warehouse network system Marcus had built, despite having touched almost none of its actual code. Derek didn't see Marcus as a threat. He saw him as a resource to be quietly absorbed, a man too tired and too private to ever correct the record, and for a long time, he was right. The stakes, as Lauren understood them heading into that spring, were enormous. Halden's contract with the logistics conglomerate, Corvail Freight, was up for renewal in 14 weeks, and Corvail's leadership had made it unmistakably clear that any repeat of the 11-hour system outage from the previous winter, an outage that had cost Corvail nearly $2 million in delayed shipments, would end the relationship permanently. Losing Corvail wouldn't just hurt Halden's revenue. It would trigger a covenant default on the company's credit facility, the kind of technical detail that sounds dry in a board memo and translates, in plain terms, to layoffs numbering in the hundreds. Lauren had staked her first year as CEO on keeping that contract alive, and Derek Song had assured her, repeatedly and confidently, that the system was fully documented, fully redundant, and fully under his team's control. Nobody in that boardroom had any reason to doubt him. Nobody, that is, except the quiet man who still alone, late at night when nobody was watching, logged in remotely to check the one subsystem he knew Derek's team had never actually understood. Marcus never mentioned it to anyone. He had learned, in the flattest and most exhausting way a person can learn something, that being right and being believed were two entirely different things, and that a single father with a daughter to raise could not afford to spend his limited energy fighting for credit that nobody was in a hurry to give him. He went to work. He fixed what needed fixing quietly off the record in the after-hours windows nobody audited. He picked up Emily at 5:15. He made dinner, usually something simple, and let her tell him about her day, while he only half listened to the details and fully listened to the sound of her voice, which was, some nights, the only thing that made the day feel survivable. He told himself this was enough. He told himself nobody needed to know what he used to be, because knowing would have meant explaining Diane, and explaining Diane was a door he had no intention of opening in a fluorescent-lit conference room full of strangers. 11 weeks before the Corvail renewal deadline, that quiet arrangement collapsed in a single, ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday. The kind of day nobody circles on a calendar in advance, but that ends up mattering more than any of the ones they do. Emily had been running a fever since Sunday night. Low at first, the kind a parent watches and waits out, but by Tuesday morning it had climbed to 102. And the babysitter Marcus normally relied on had a family emergency of her own, and canceled with less than an hour's notice. Marcus made 4 phone calls before 7 a.m. trying to find anyone else, a neighbor, a coworker's spouse, a backup sitter he'd used exactly once, and came up empty every single time. He had, that morning, precisely 2 options in front of him. Stay home with his sick daughter and miss the final technical review before the Corvail system's quarterly stress test, or bring Emily to the office in the small conference room off the server floor, wrap her in a blanket on the couch there, and hope she slept through the 2 hours he needed. He chose the second option because the stress test mattered, because he had personally rewritten the failover logic that would be tested that morning, and because some stubborn, tired part of him still wanted, even quietly, even without saying so to a single person, to make sure the system held. It held. The stress test passed cleanly, every metric green, the kind of result that should have been unremarkable precisely because Picard made it unremarkable through 18 months of careful design. But at 9:40 that morning, exhausted from 3 consecutive nights of broken sleep, checking on Emily's temperature every 90 minutes, Marcus made an error he would have caught instantly on any other day. He pushed a configuration update to the staging environment instead of the isolated test environment, a 3-character difference in a server address that any tired engineer might type without noticing. And for 11 minutes, before he caught it and rolled it back himself, the staging system threw a cascade of alert emails to half the executive floor, including, unfortunately, Lauren Mitchell, who was at that exact moment sitting across a table from 2 Corvail executives doing a routine confidence-building site visit. Nothing broke, no data was lost, no client system was ever actually affected, because staging was by definition not live. But the alert emails landed on Lauren's phone in front of the 2 Corvail executives she was trying to reassure about Halden's operational discipline at the worst possible instant, and Derek Song, sensing an opportunity with the instinct of a man who had built his entire career on instinct like this, leaned over during the break and told Lauren, in a tone of practiced regret, that we've had some concerns about Marcus's focus lately, understandably, given everything going on at home, but this can't happen again this close to renewal. He never mentioned that the failover logic protecting Corvail's actual production system, the one that mattered, was Marcus's design and had performed flawlessly an hour earlier. He simply let the timing do the damage for him. Lauren called an executive review that afternoon. She did not call it to be cruel. She called it because she was 39 years old, under more pressure than she had ever been under in her professional life, watching a 14-week countdown to a contract that would define whether hundreds of people kept their jobs. And she needed, in that moment, to demonstrate to the room and to herself that she was in control of something. Marcus stood in front of 11 people and did not explain about Emily's fever, did not explain about the 3 sleepless nights, did not mention that he had personally caught and fixed his own error within 11 minutes without being asked. He had spent 3 years training himself not to ask for sympathy from people who had never once asked him how he was doing. And some habits, once built out of necessity, don't undo themselves just because undoing them would help. When Lauren, frustrated and cornered and looking for the fastest way to signal decisiveness to 2 watching board members on the call, said the words, "Anyone could do your job," she said them the way people say things under pressure, quickly, and without doing the arithmetic of what they actually meant. Marcus set down his badge. He walked out. And what nobody in that room understood in that moment was that the man walking away held, entirely inside his own head, and in a handful of undocumented scripts on his personal laptop, the only complete working knowledge of the failover system standing between Halden Industries and the collapse of its largest contract. If you've ever been the one who quietly held everything together while nobody noticed, and then got dismissed the moment you finally slipped, even once, we want to hear about it in the comments. You're not alone in this room tonight, and stories like Marcus's exist because so many of you have lived a version of them. He cleared out his desk in 11 minutes. He didn't say goodbye to anyone except Priya Anand, the junior systems analyst 2 desks over, who had, over the past year, quietly noticed that Marcus knew things about the Corvail system that nobody else's documentation reflected, and who now stood frozen, unsure whether to say something or let him go in peace. He picked Emily up from the conference room couch, still warm with fever, wrapped her more securely in the blanket, and carried her out through the lobby without looking back at the security desk, where he had to surrender his parking pass. He drove home with his daughter half asleep against the passenger window, and he did not cry, and he did not call anyone, and he told himself, the way he had told himself so many things over the past 3 years, that this too was survivable, that he would find something else, that Emily never needed to know how the day had actually gone. He did not know, as he pulled into his driveway that evening, that 4 floors above the lobby he'd just walked through, the company's chairman, an older man named Walter Kessler, who had built Halden from a 2-person operation 40 years earlier and still kept an office he rarely used, had just asked a question in an unrelated finance meeting that was about to detonate everything Lauren Mitchell believed she understood about the man she'd just fired. 9 days would pass before Walter Kessler's question found its way into a room Lauren couldn't ignore, and by then, The countdown to the Corvale renewal would have 13 weeks left on the clock instead of 14. Walter Kessler had a habit, in his 70s now and technically semi-retired, of wandering into meetings he had no formal reason to attend, mostly because 40 years of building something from nothing had left him constitutionally incapable of not asking questions when he sensed the answers being given were too smooth. 9 days after Marcus walked out, Walter sat in on a routine finance review, where the topic of Corvale's system redundancy came up, and he asked, almost offhandedly, who currently held the master documentation for the failover architecture. Derek Song answered smoothly that his team had full ownership. Walter, who happened to remember, in the specific way older people sometimes remember details younger executives assume nobody tracked, that it was a quiet fellow, Reed, I believe, who had personally walked him through that exact system's design 3 years earlier during a board presentation, asked a simple follow-up. Had anyone actually verified that Derek's team could operate the failover logic without Marcus, given that Marcus had, as Walter understood it, recently left the company? The room went quiet in a smaller, colder version of the silence that had filled the executive review 9 days earlier. Derek said, with slightly less confidence than before, that the documentation was thorough and his engineers were more than capable. Walter, unconvinced, asked for a live demonstration of a failover simulation before the end of the week. It took Derek's team 4 days to even locate the correct configuration files, and when they finally attempted the simulation, the failover triggered a partial cascade failure that took the staging environment down for 6 hours. Not production, thankfully, but close enough that 2 junior engineers on Derek's team, panicking, admitted under direct questioning from Walter that they had never actually understood the custom timeout logic Marcus had written, that most of what they'd been maintaining was, in practice, guesswork dressed up in confident language. Lauren was in that room. She watched the confidence drain out of Derek's face in real time, watched 2 engineers who reported to him confess, essentially, that the system protecting $412 million of annual revenue was being operated on hope rather than understanding, and she felt something cold settle into her stomach that had nothing to do with the countdown clock and everything to do with the specific memory of a man setting his badge down on a conference table without a single word of protest. She asked Priya Anand, the junior analyst who had said nothing 9 days earlier, whether there was anyone else who had worked closely on the original system design. Priya hesitated for a long moment, and then told her the truth she had been sitting on since the day Marcus left. That half the critical logic in that system had Marcus's initials in the revision history going back 3 years, that Derek's team had, as far as she could tell, never written a single line of the failover code itself, only maintained and occasionally misunderstood it, and that Marcus had personally caught and silently fixed at least 6 near misses over the past year that nobody else on the team had even noticed were problems. Lauren didn't sleep well that night. She sat in her home office with the original architecture documents pulled up on her laptop, cross-referencing commit histories, watching a very clear and very damning picture assemble itself. A man who had built the exact system her company's survival depended on, who had been quietly correcting other people's mistakes for years without credit, who had never once escalated a complaint about it, and whom she had personally dismissed in front of 11 people, with a sentence she now understood to be not just unkind but factually, catastrophically wrong. She thought about the alert emails from that Tuesday morning, the 11 minutes of staging errors that had embarrassed her in front of Corvale's executives, and she made herself do the arithmetic she'd skipped in the moment. 11 minutes, on a system he'd caught and fixed himself, on a day when. She learned this only now from Priya, delivered gently but without softening the point. His daughter had been running a 102-degree fever, and he'd had nowhere else to bring her. Here's a question worth sitting with, because people don't always agree on the answer. When someone endures years of being overlooked without ever saying a word about what they're actually capable of, is the silence a kind of quiet dignity worth admiring? Or is it a mistake that leaves everyone, including the person staying silent, worse off in the end? Different people in Marcus's shoes might have handled it differently, and there's no single right answer. But it's worth thinking about who you'd rather be in that room. Lauren made a decision that night that surprised even her. She did not send Marcus an email through HR. She did not have an assistant place a call. She looked up his home address in the company's old personnel file, the one that still listed him as an active employee, because HR hadn't finished processing the termination paperwork. And the following Saturday morning, without telling anyone on her executive team, she drove 40 minutes out of the city to a modest single-story house on a quiet street with a child's bicycle lying on its side in the front yard, and she stood on the porch for nearly a full minute before she found the nerve to knock. Marcus opened the door in a faded t-shirt, clearly surprised, Emily peeking out from behind his leg in socked feet, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Lauren had rehearsed an opening line in the car, something professional and measured about reconsidering the terms of his departure. And standing on that porch, looking at the man she had humiliated and the small girl gripping the back of his shirt, every rehearsed word left her completely. What came out instead was smaller and truer. She was sorry, she said, and she didn't fully understand yet how sorry she needed to be, but she wanted to. Marcus looked at her for a long moment and then said quietly that Corval's failover threshold on server cluster 4 had never actually been fixed, that he'd meant to submit the patch the week he left, and that if nobody addressed it before the next load spike, the real production system, not staging, was going to go down within days, and that this was the only reason he was even considering letting her inside. That warning turned out to be exactly right, and exactly on time, because 6 days later, on a Thursday afternoon nobody at Halden Industries would ever forget, server cluster 4 failed under load precisely the way Marcus had predicted, and the entire Corval contract came within 11 minutes of collapsing for real. The failure began at 2:14 on a Thursday afternoon, not with alarms or panic, but with a single quiet metric on a dashboard ticking past its threshold, the kind of detail that meant nothing to anyone who didn't understand exactly what it represented, and everything to the one person who did. Derek Song's team, following the documentation they had inherited and never fully understood, initiated the standard failover protocol, the one that had always worked in testing, and watched, with rising horror, as it triggered the exact cascading collapse Marcus had privately warned Lauren about 6 days earlier. Cluster 4's redundant node attempted to absorb the full production load at once, instead of ramping gradually. A design flaw buried 3 layers deep in a piece of custom timeout logic that only Marcus had ever fully mapped, because only Marcus had written it, alone, at 11 at night, years earlier, while Diane brought him coffee and told him someday someone would understand what he'd built. Lauren was in her office when the first outage alert hit, and unlike the last time, she did not reach for blame. She reached for her phone and called Marcus directly, the number Priya had quietly kept from an old team directory, and asked him, without preamble, without title, whether he could help. Marcus was in his kitchen making Emily's after-school snack when the call came in, and he stood very still for a moment, looking at his daughter coloring at the table, and then said he would need remote access and 45 minutes, and that someone needed to physically hold Cluster 4's incoming traffic at 50% capacity the instant he gave the word, because the fix wasn't a patch anyone could push cold. It required someone who understood the exact sequence of the timeout logic's dependency chain, 3 specific configuration values that existed nowhere in Derek's documentation, because Marcus had never written them down anywhere except inside his own head. For the next 41 minutes, Marcus worked from his kitchen table, laptop balanced next to a plate of apple slices, walking Priya Anand through a sequence of commands over a shared screen while Emily sat beside him, uncharacteristically quiet, sensing without being told that something serious was happening. He spoke in short, precise instructions, no wasted words, the same restrained calm he had carried out of the conference room 3 weeks earlier. Except this time, the room on the other end of the call was holding its breath, waiting on every syllable. At minute 38, with Cluster 4's load climbing toward a second cascade point, Marcus identified the exact configuration mismatch, a timeout value Derek's team had adjusted 8 months earlier, thinking they were optimizing performance, without realizing it broke the delicate 3-way dependency Marcus had built the entire failover sequence around. He talked Priya through reverting it, live, on a production system, with Lauren standing behind her chair watching every keystroke. At minute 43, the dashboard metric stabilized. At minute 45, Corval's automated warehouse network, unaware how close it had come to an outage that would have cost millions and ended a contract worth nearly a third of Halden's revenue, simply kept running exactly as it was supposed to. The room on Halden's 40th floor erupted into the kind of relief that doesn't announce itself loudly, just a collective exhale. A few people sitting down hard in chairs they'd been standing beside for the better part of an hour. Derek Song stood at the back of the room, pale, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The tie-out value he'd personally approved 8 months earlier, the one that had nearly caused a catastrophic outage, sat right there on the shared screen with his own account name in the revision history, undeniable, unambiguous. The single piece of evidence that ended, without any need for further discussion, the story he had spent 3 years quietly constructing about a system he barely understood. He resigned 2 weeks later, before HR had even finished its internal review, taking a position at a smaller firm across the state where nobody yet knew to ask the right questions about his revision history. It's fair to wonder, and people watching this probably fall on different sides of it. Should a company keep trusting confident, credentialed newcomers with critical systems just because they interview well and speak the right language in a boardroom? Or does real trust have to be earned the slower way, through years of quiet, unglamorous competence that doesn't always announce itself? There's no single right answer, but Halden Industries was about to learn the cost of getting that particular question wrong. Lauren didn't wait for the internal review to conclude before she acted. 2 days after the outage was resolved, she called an all-hands meeting on the 40th floor, the same conference room, the same table where she had once told Marcus that anyone could do his job. And this time, when Marcus walked in, badge freshly reissued, he was not the one standing at the head of the table being questioned. Lauren stood there instead, and in front of the same 11 executives who had watched her humiliate him 3 weeks earlier. She told them plainly and without hedging that the company's largest contract had been saved by a man she had wrongly dismissed, that the failure had never been his, and that the responsibility for what happened afterward belonged entirely to her for not knowing, before that Thursday afternoon, exactly what he had built and exactly what he had been quietly carrying for 3 years, without a single word of complaint. She offered him his old title back that same afternoon, with a raise, a public statement to the board, and formal credit restored on every piece of documentation bearing his original design work. Marcus listened to all of it without much visible reaction, the same stillness he carried into every room, and then he said something that surprised her more than anything else that day. He didn't want his old title. He wanted something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with restoring his own name, and everything to do with what came next. And Lauren realized, standing there in front of the board, that she had badly misjudged not just what kind of engineer Marcus Reed was, but what kind of man. 8 weeks would pass, through the finalized Corval renewal, through a quiet restructuring of Halden's systems team, before Lauren understood exactly what Marcus had asked for that afternoon, and why it mattered more to her than the $412 million the whole company had nearly lost. What Marcus had asked for, standing in that conference room, while 11 executives waited to hear whether he'd take the promotion and the raise and the public vindication being offered to him, was smaller than any of them expected and, in its own way, harder to grant. He didn't want his old director title back. He wanted a formal, documented mentorship structure built into the systems team, one that required every senior engineer, including any future hire in Derek's former role, to work directly alongside the junior staff who actually maintained critical infrastructure, so that no single system at Halden Industries would ever again exist only inside one person's head. Undocumented, unprotected, dependent on one tired man showing up at 11 at night with nobody bringing him coffee anymore. He wanted flexible scheduling written into policy, not granted as a favor, for any employee balancing caregiving responsibilities, so that no one else would ever have to choose between a sick child and a stress test the way he once had. And he wanted Priya Anand, the junior analyst who had quietly kept the truth alive when nobody else would say it out loud, promoted to lead the redesigned team. Lauren gave him all of it, and in the 8 weeks that followed, she did something that cost her more than any of it on paper. She stood in front of the full board during the Corval renewal presentation and told them, unprompted, exactly what had almost happened and exactly whose work had prevented it, risking the kind of scrutiny that could have easily been buried in a clean success story instead. 2 board members raised, pointed questions about her judgment in the original dismissal. She didn't deflect them. She answered everyone directly, and the renewal, when it finally came through, carried Corvale's explicit written acknowledgement of Halden's improved operational transparency, a condition that existed, in the end, because Lauren had chosen the harder, more honest telling of the story over the easier one that would have protected her own reputation. Has someone in your own life ever been written off before anyone bothered to really see what they were carrying? A coworker, a neighbor, maybe someone in your own family who went quiet after a loss and got mistaken for someone who simply stopped caring. Tell us about them in the comments, even if it's only to finally say, publicly, the thing you never got the chance to say to them directly. And if you believe the quiet, overlooked people in your own life deserve to be seen the way Marcus finally was, we'd be honored to have you stay part of this story with us. Subscribe, and we'll keep bringing you the ones worth telling. The months that followed were not dramatic. That was, in its way, the whole point. Lauren began stopping by Marcus's house every few weeks at first, ostensibly to check on how the new mentorship structure was working. And then, gradually, for reasons that had less and less to do with Halden Industries at all, she learned to sit quietly at that same kitchen table where the Corvale crisis had been solved over apple slices. Learned that Emily liked to narrate her coloring pages out loud in exhaustive detail, and that Marcus listened to every word of it without once looking at his phone. She learned, slowly, in the unhurried way that real trust gets rebuilt after it's been broken, that Marcus wasn't measuring her by the apology she'd given on his porch, but by what she did every single week afterward, quietly, without an audience. It was nearly a year after that Thursday afternoon outage when Emily, 8 years old now, sitting at the same kitchen table doing homework while Lauren helped her sound out a word she was stuck on, looked up and asked, without any particular weight in her voice, the way children ask the most enormous questions as if they were nothing at all, whether Lauren was going to keep coming around. Marcus, standing at the stove with his back to both of them, went very still for a moment, the same stillness that had once made a room full of executives assume there was nothing much going on behind his eyes, and said quietly that he hoped so. Lauren looked at Emily's homework, at the crooked, careful handwriting, at the refrigerator covered in drawings that had slowly, over the past year, started including a fourth figure alongside Marcus. Emily and the shape of a house, and she said yes, she planned on it, for as long as they'd have her. On his old company badge, the one he'd set down so quietly on that conference table over a year earlier, Marcus had once kept a small strip of tape across the back with Diane's handwriting on it. 3 words she'd written years before she died. Build it right. He still carried that badge, tucked in a drawer at home now instead of clipped to his shirt, and some mornings, before Lauren arrived to walk Emily to the bus stop with him, he would open that drawer and look at it for a moment before closing it again, not out of grief anymore, so much as a quiet kind of gratitude. The sense that the thing he had built, and the family that had slowly assembled itself around the wreckage of losing everything, had finally, after all this time, been built right. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this. Being underestimated doesn't mean you weren't the one holding everything together the whole time. Sometimes the people who talk the least are carrying the most, and sometimes it takes losing them completely before anyone bothers to ask what they actually knew. Marcus never asked to be seen. He just kept showing up, quietly, for the people and the systems that depended on him long after anyone thought to say thank you. If this story reminded you of someone who deserves to finally be seen the way he was, stay with us. There's always another story like this one waiting, and we'll be here to tell it with you.